It was the kind of morning that Minnesota winters manufacture with quiet cruelty. The sky pressing down in flat pewter sheets, the temperature sitting at 11 degrees below zero, the bare oak trees along County Road 7 standing like sentinels that had long since stopped keeping watch. The date was February 4th, 1993. The town was Braham, Minnesota, population 1,247, a place where people still left their back doors unlocked, where neighbors brought casseroles when someone was sick, where the worst thing most residents had ever encountered was a fender bender outside the Dairy Queen on a Friday night. Her name was Carla Anne Voss. She was 31 years old. She had brown hair she kept in a practical braid, a laugh that people who loved her described as the kind that made you laugh too, even when you didn't know why, and a habit of leaving small handwritten notes for her children on the kitchen counter every single morning without fail. She was a mother. She was a wife. She was, by every measure that matters, a woman fully alive in the world. A woman with plans and preferences, and a dentist appointment on February 9th she would never keep. And then, sometime between 7:15 in the morning and 11:42 that same Tuesday, Carla Anne Voss disappeared from the face of the earth. The question that would haunt the entire state of Minnesota for the next 3 decades. The question that lived inside every photograph, every court document, every whispered conversation at the church potlucks that continued long after people stopped saying her name out loud, was not simply what happened to Carla Voss. The question was, who in her life had already decided it would? Braham, Minnesota sits at the northeastern edge of Ysemonte County, roughly 60 miles north of Minneapolis in a stretch of land that looks, depending on the season, either achingly beautiful or quietly desolate. In February, it is both. The town grew up around dairy farming and timber in the late 19th century, and by 1993, it had settled into the particular rhythm of rural Midwestern life, steady, proud, slightly suspicious of anything that came from more than 40 miles away. The downtown was 4 blocks long. There was a hardware store, a bank, a Lutheran church large enough to seat the whole town, and a diner called Rosen's where the coffee was strong, and the booths had been reupholstered exactly once since 1971. The Voss family lived on the western edge of town, on a gravel road called Birch Hollow Drive, in a white 2-story house with green shutters and a detached garage that leaned slightly to the left. The yard was modest, a swing set the children had outgrown but nobody had taken down, a rusting basketball hoop at the end of the driveway, a garden that Carla kept meticulously from May to October and which lay dormant and snow-covered in February. The house sat on just under 2 acres. Their nearest neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Havorson, lived a 1/4 mile to the east. Carla shared the house with her husband, Dennis Roy Voss, who was 36, and their 2 children, Tyler, who was 7, and Emma, who was 5. Dennis worked as a mid-level manager at the Ysemonte County Public Works Department, a position he had held for 9 years without distinction and without complaint. He drove a 1991 Ford F-150, charcoal gray, which had 78,300 miles on the odometer that winter. He was by most accounts a quiet man. Not warm exactly, but not cold. A man who filled a room the way furniture fills a room, present, functional, noticed mainly when something was wrong. Carla, by contrast, was the connective tissue of the household and of the wider community around it. She worked part-time as a dental hygienist at Dr. Feldman's office in town on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She volunteered on Wednesday evenings at the Ysemonte County food shelf. She was room mother for Emma's kindergarten class. She kept a journal. She called her sister, Linda Meacham, in Duluth every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock without exception. She had done so for 11 years. She had not called on Sunday, February 7, 1993, because by then she was already 3 days gone. Clears throat. The morning of February 4th had been, by every surviving account, almost aggressively ordinary. Carla woke at 5:50 a.m. as she did every weekday. She made coffee. The neighbor Dorothy Havorson would later tell investigators she could sometimes smell it drifting from the Voss house on cold mornings when the wind was right, which tells you something about how still and intimate those winter mornings were. Carla packed 2 lunch bags, one with a peanut butter and honey sandwich, an apple, and a small packet of crackers for Tyler, and one with a cream cheese sandwich and raisins for Emma. She left a note on the kitchen counter as she always did. The note read in her precise, looping handwriting, "Have a wonderful day. I love you all the way to the top of the sky. Mom." At 7:12 a.m., Dennis backed the F-150 out of the garage and drove Tyler and Emma to Braham Elementary, which was a 4.2-mile drive along County Road 7. He signed them in at the front desk, a detail confirmed by the school's morning log, which recorded his signature at 7:27 a.m., and he drove away. At 7:43 a.m., a mail carrier named Roy Stensrud drove past the Voss property on his route and noted, as he would later tell the Isenti County Sheriff's Department, that he saw Carla standing in the front doorway of the house. She was wearing her blue quilted coat. She was watching the road. He waved. She waved back. Roy Stensrud saw Carla Voss alive at 7:43 a.m. on February 4, 1993. He would be the last person outside of that household to confirm it. Dennis Voss arrived at the Isenti County Public Works building at 8:05 a.m. 3 colleagues confirmed it. He was at his desk by 8:10. He stayed through a department meeting at 9 a.m., attended a site review at 10:15, and ate lunch at his desk. He told investigators he called home at approximately 11:30 a.m. and received no answer, which he said he did not find unusual because Carla sometimes ran errands. At 3:47 p.m., Dennis picked up Tyler and Emma from school. He drove them home. He pulled into the driveway on Birch Hollow Drive, and he walked into a house that was empty. Carla's coat was gone. Her purse, a brown leather shoulder bag with a broken clasp she'd been meaning to fix for months, was gone. Her car, a 1989 Honda Civic in burgundy red, was still in the garage. The lunch note was still on the counter. The coffee pot had burned down to a dark, bitter residue. The swing set in the yard hung perfectly still. The toy truck Tyler had left in the snow the day before lay on its side near the front steps. Dennis Voss waited 4.5 hours before he called the Isenti County Sheriff's Department. He made the call at 8:22 p.m. when Deputy Carl Magnusson arrived at the house at 8:49 p.m. Dennis met him at the door. Magnusson would later write in his report that Dennis appeared calm, not relieved to see help arriving, not tearful, not frantic. Calm. The deputy noted it, he wrote it down, he filed it, and then the search for Carla Voss began. By the morning of February 5, 1993, the Isenti County Sheriff's Department had activated a full missing persons response. Sheriff Dale Owerter authorized aerial support through the State Patrol, coordinated with neighboring Kennebec and Chisago County Sheriff's offices, and put out a statewide bolo be on the lookout for Carla Voss and her description. 5 feet 4 inches, 138 pounds, brown hair in a braid, last seen wearing a blue quilted coat and dark jeans. The ground search was immediate and extensive. Volunteers, and in Braham in 1993, that meant nearly the entire adult population of the town, assembled at the Lutheran Church parking lot at first light. They walked fields. They checked the frozen surfaces of two nearby ponds, Lake Fancher and a smaller, unnamed body of water locals called Birch Pond, looking for breaks in the ice that a person or a car might have made. They searched the tree lines, the drainage ditches, the old gravel pits south of town. They found nothing. The temperature dropped to 18 below overnight on February 5th. Dogs from the Anoka County K-9 unit were brought in. They tracked a scent from the front doorway of the Voss house to the end of the driveway, then lost it at the road. The handler, a 15-year veteran named Dale Klinkhammer, told investigators that the scent loss at the road was consistent with someone having entered a vehicle there. He noted it suggested the meeting with a vehicle at that location had been arranged, not random. The community response was enormous and immediate. Within 48 hours, over 300 volunteers had participated in the search. Carla's photograph, the one from the previous Christmas, where she was laughing with her arm around Tyler and Emma, her head tilted back, was stapled to telephone poles and taped into every shop window in Braham. The diner, Rosen's, kept a pot of free coffee going around the clock for search volunteers for 11 consecutive days. And then there was Dennis. Those who knew him said he seemed distracted at the family meetings Sheriff Order organized at the house on Birch Hollow Drive. He sat with his hands on his knees. He answered questions precisely. He did not ask many questions of his own, did not demand to know what leads were being pursued, did not badger investigators for updates the way desperate husbands on television do, the way desperate husbands in real life usually do. He arranged for his mother-in-law to come stay with the children. He went to work on February 8th, 4 days after his wife vanished, and was seen eating lunch in the break room. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves. Investigators began developing what they called, in their documentation, a circle of concern, a polite professional phrase for the quiet, growing suspicion that was already crystallizing in the conference room of the Isenti County Sheriff's Department. There were timeline discrepancies that did not resolve easily. Dennis had told investigators he called home at 11:30 a.m. on the day Carla disappeared. Telephone records, subpoenaed within 72 hours, showed a call from the Public Works building to the Voss home at 11:42 a.m., 12 minutes later than he'd stated. A small difference, but investigators noted it because Dennis was, by his colleagues' accounts, a precise and methodical man. A man who, his supervisor noted, documented everything in writing and was rarely off by more than a minute or two on any time estimate he gave. The odometer on the F-150 presented a more significant inconsistency. On the morning of February 4th, a coworker named Brian Gustafson had borrowed a battery-powered drill from the bed of Dennis's truck in the Public Works parking lot and had, out of long habit, glanced at the instrument panel. He noted the mileage at approximately 78,314 miles. When investigators checked the truck on February 6th, the odometer read 78,391 miles. The drive from the Public Works building to Braham Elementary was 4.2 miles. The return to work was 4.2 miles. An additional drive at end of day to pick up the children would account for another 8.4 miles. That was a total of 16.8 miles, meaning the truck should have read, roughly, 78,331 miles when Gustafson checked it, and around 78,339 by end of day, accounting for Dennis's standard route home. Instead, it read 78,391, 52 miles more than expected. Investigators could not initially account for those miles. Dennis, when asked, said he must have taken a different route home, perhaps driven out to look for Carla. He could not specify where he had driven. He could not explain the route. Clear's throat. The physical evidence inside the house was, in some ways, more disturbing for what it lacked than for what it contained. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken dishes, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds suggested anywhere in the environment. The house was, and this detail appears in Magnusson's report with a kind of quiet emphasis, very clean. Unusually clean for a household with 2 young children and a morning that should have included breakfast preparation. The coffee cup Carla had used that morning was washed. The sink was scrubbed. The counter where the lunch note still sat was wiped to an almost institutional cleanliness. Investigators could not definitively determine whether Carla had cleaned before whatever happened to her, or whether someone had cleaned after. The forensic team from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension arrived on February 7th and spent 2 full days processing the residence. They collected samples. They documented everything. Their full findings would not be disclosed publicly. Not then, and not for many years. By March 1993, with no body found and no confirmed crime scene, the investigation had reached what Sheriff Order acknowledged in a press conference was a significant challenge. The case did not close, but it slowed. The daily briefings became weekly. The weekly briefings became monthly. The 143-page case file sat in a cabinet in the Isenti County Sheriff's Department, behind a door that stayed locked. The answers it held were waiting for someone to come back and ask the right questions. That wait would last 27 years. By September of 1993, 7 months after Carla disappeared, Dennis Voss had sold the house on Birch Hollow Drive. The price was $67,500, $12,000 below what comparable homes on the same road had sold for that year, a detail that meant nothing to most people and everything to those who were watching. He moved with Tyler and Emma to Pine City, a town 30 miles to the northeast, where he had secured a similar position with Pine County's Public Works Department. He bought a ranch house on a quiet street 3 blocks from an elementary school. He enrolled the children. He bought new furniture. He joined a congregation at the First Lutheran Church of Pine City. He introduced himself to neighbors as a widower, a word that implied loss but not absence, grief but not mystery. Most of his new neighbors did not know Carla's name. They did not know about the swing set or the toy truck or the lunch notes or the 52 missing miles. They saw a quiet man raising 2 children alone, and they brought him casseroles. Clears throat. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, truly doubted them, the kind of doubt that burrows beneath the ordinary surface of daily life and sits there quietly corroding everything it touches, you may understand something of what Tyler and Emma Voss experienced in the years that followed. They were 7 and 5 when their mother disappeared. They were old enough to remember her laugh. They were too young to understand what the adults around them were carefully not saying. What emerged in the years that followed, pieced together later from family testimony, and from observations by teachers, counselors, and family friends, was a portrait of 2 children navigating the wreckage of a household that had been rebuilt on top of an unmarked grave. Emma began drawing houses, not unusual for a 5-year-old girl except that she drew them obsessively and always the same way. The house with the green shutters, the swing set in the yard, a figure standing in the doorway in a blue coat. She drew them in kindergarten. She drew them in 1st grade. Her teachers noted it with concern but attributed it to grief and adjustment. They suggested art therapy. Dennis declined for reasons he did not explain. Tyler, by the time he reached the 4th grade, had developed a pronounced stutter that he did not have before his mother's disappearance. A speech therapist named Gwendolyn Price, who worked with him at Pine City Elementary between 1994 and 1996, later recalled, in conversations that would become important to investigators that Tyler once said to her, in the particular halting way children sometimes deliver the most devastating truths. "I think my dad knows where my mom is." She asked him what he meant. He looked at the window for a long time. Then he said he didn't know. Then he went back to his exercises. Gwendolyn Price wrote it in her case notes. She filed it. She thought about it periodically for the next 2 decades. The marriage of Dennis Voss to a woman named Sandra Kolb in August of 1995, less than 3 years after Carla's disappearance, was noted with quiet alarm by Carla's family, particularly her sister Linda Meacham, who drove down from Duluth to attend because she could not quite articulate why it felt important to be present and watching. Linda had kept everything, every letter Carla had written her, every photograph, every Sunday phone call recorded in a small address book where Linda had begun, somewhere around 1994, keeping notes on her conversations with Dennis about the case. Notes that documented, with the precision of a woman who did not quite know what she was building, every inconsistency, every deflection, every moment when his answers did not match the questions she was asking. In 1998, Dennis and Sandra had a child together, a daughter they named Claire. The family moved again, this time to Mora, Minnesota, another 30 miles north. Tyler was now 12, Emma was 10. The household was, by observable external measures, functional and ordinary. Dennis coached a youth soccer team. Sandra taught Sunday school. Claire grew up in a house full of photographs of people she did not know were absent. But Sandra Kolb Voss began to notice things. She would not speak about these things publicly for a long time, but she would eventually, and in extraordinary detail. What she noticed first, she said later, was the way Dennis responded to Carla's name. Not with grief, not even with the particular exhausted flatness of a man who has processed his sorrow and come through the other side. With something she described as a kind of vigilance, a brief, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, a shift in his eyes, as if the name were a doorbell he had learned not to answer. She noticed it at family gatherings. She noticed it when Carla's children mentioned their mother, which Tyler and Emma learned quickly to do less and less often. She noticed it late at night when Dennis, who was a very light sleeper, would sometimes sit in the kitchen in the dark for hours at a time. She did not know what to make of what she was noticing. For those who have ever noticed something that changes everything and then spent years convincing yourself you haven't noticed it, you may understand the particular silence Sandra lived in for almost 2 decades. The marriage began deteriorating around 2008. By 2011, Sandra and Dennis were living in the same house and conducting what she later described as entirely parallel lives, eating at the same table, sitting in the same pew, attending the same school events for Claire without any meaningful contact between them. She moved out in February of 2012. She took Claire. She did not initially go to the authorities. She was not entirely sure, she said later, what she would tell them. Then Tyler Voss, who was now 26 years old and living in Duluth, called his Aunt Linda Meacham in the spring of 2012. He had been thinking, he told her, about some of the things he remembered from when he was 7. He had been thinking about a specific morning. He had not been able to stop thinking about it. He said he thought it was time to talk to someone. Linda Meacham opened the address book where she had been making notes for 19 years. She found the number for the Isenti County Sheriff's Department. She composed herself for a long moment. Then she dialed. The call came into the Isenti County Sheriff's Department on April 14, 2012, a Monday at 2:17 in the afternoon. The deputy who took the call, a young woman named Alicia Pfeiffer who had been with the department for 3 years, recognized the Voss name from the case files she'd reviewed during her training. She transferred the call immediately to Sheriff's investigator Paul Brandt, who had spent 18 years in law enforcement and who had, purely out of personal compulsion, read the complete 1993 Voss case file twice in his career. Once when he joined the department in 2002, and again in 2009, when the BCA had briefly re-examined several unresolved cases from the decade. Linda Meacham talked for 47 minutes. Brandt took 11 pages of handwritten notes. When the call ended, he sat for a moment looking at what he'd written. Then he stood up and walked down the hall to his supervisor's office. "The Voss file," he said. "I need to pull the Voss file." What Tyler Voss had told his aunt, and what he would tell investigators in a recorded interview conducted in Duluth on April 22, 2012, concerned the morning of February 4, 1993. Tyler had been 7 years old. He remembered being dropped at school. He remembered his teacher's name, Mrs. Halberg. He remembered a coloring activity they did with red and orange paper. He remembered, with the uncanny precision that certain traumatic memories encode in children, what happened when his father arrived to pick him and Emma up that afternoon. Tyler said, "He was already in the parking lot when we came out. Most of the other parents waited by the door. My dad was already there in the truck. We got in. Emma asked where Mom was. My dad said she'd gone to see Grandma. That was the first thing. Grandma lived in Duluth. We didn't go to Duluth without packing bags. There were no bags in the truck." He said that he remembered his father's hands on the steering wheel. He said the knuckles were abraded, scraped, reddish, as though he had struck something. He said he had noticed it and then noticed Dennis noticing him noticing, and something in his father's face had made Tyler look away and not mention it. He was 7 years old. He did not have language for what he had seen in his father's face. But he had carried the image of those hands for 27 years, and at 26, he finally had words for what the expression had been. It had been a warning. Tyler also told investigators that sometime in the spring of 1993, while they were still living on Birch Hollow Drive in the final months before the move to Pine City, he had observed his father outside in the yard, in the area behind the detached garage, moving what appeared to be soil, using a long-handled shovel. He had watched from the upstairs window. When he came downstairs and asked his father what he was doing, Dennis told him he was filling a hole where the frost had heaved the ground. Tyler said he accepted this at 7. He said he had thought about it with different eyes at 26. Clears throat. The investigation that reopened in April of 2012 was a substantially different undertaking than the one from 1993. Investigator Brandt partnered with agents from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension's Cold Case Unit, a specialized team that had been formally constituted in 2007, as well as a forensic analyst from the University of Minnesota whose specialty was the recovery of biological material from disturbed soil in cold climates. They went back to Birch Hollow Drive. The white house with the green shutters had changed hands twice since Dennis sold it in 1993. The current owners, a couple named Rolf and Diane Erickson, cooperated fully. On May 8, 2012, forensic investigators began excavation of the area behind the detached garage. The ground was soft enough by then. The work was slow and methodical, conducted over 2 days with trowels and brushes, and a soil analysis protocol the BCA team had refined over years of similar work. On the afternoon of May 9, 2012, at approximately 3:30 p.m., investigators recovered human remains. The recovery was conducted in silence, which was perhaps appropriate, and then in a controlled and precise professional activity that took several hours and was witnessed by Paul Brandt, 3 BCA agents, the forensic analyst, and 2 deputies from the Isenti County Sheriff's Department. When the grid had been fully cleared and documented, one of the BCA agents, a 12-year veteran named Marcus Ellefson, sat back on his heels and looked at Brandt without saying anything for a long moment. Then Ellefson said, "She was never more than 200 yards from where she made those lunch notes." The remains were transported to the Hennepin County Medical Examiner's office in Minneapolis. The forensic pathologist assigned to the case was Dr. Renata Oberg, who had extensive experience with historical remains recovery in variable soil conditions. Her examination, completed over 3 weeks, established the remains as those of a woman consistent with Carla Voss's height, age, and skeletal structure. Dental records requested from Dr. Feldman's office in Braham, which had preserved them, confirmed the identification on May 29, 2012. Carla Anne Voss had been in the ground behind her own garage for 19 years, 4 months, and 25 days. The cause of death could not be fully determined from skeletal remains at that interval. Dr. Oberg's report noted evidence of trauma to the hyoid bone, a small, U-shaped structure in the throat that is frequently damaged in cases of strangulation, though she was careful, in the measured language of forensic medicine, to characterize this as consistent with but not conclusive of manual strangulation. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. The warrant for the arrest of Dennis Roy Voss was issued by the Isenti County District Court on June 3, 2012. He was arrested at his home in Mora, Minnesota, on the morning of June 4, 2012, at 6:47. The arrest was executed by agents from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, accompanied by Pine County and Isenti County Sheriff's deputies. Neighbors on his street in Mora observed law enforcement vehicles, 4 of them, parked outside the single-story house. They watched from driveways and front windows in the early morning light. According to the arresting agent's report, Dennis Voss answered the door in a white undershirt and gray sweatpants. He had been awake, or appeared to have been. He looked at the identification presented by BCA agent Ellefson. He looked at the warrant. He did not speak for approximately 8 seconds. Then he said, "I'd like to call my attorney." He did not ask what the arrest was for. He did not say Carla's name. He did not ask about his children. He stepped back from the door to allow the agents to enter, and he put his hands together in front of him with the particular mechanical compliance of a man who has, somewhere deep in the architecture of himself, been anticipating this moment for a very long time. He was handcuffed and placed in the rear of a BCA vehicle. Neighbors watched the car pull away. Sandra Kolb Voss, who had been separated from Dennis for 4 months when investigators first contacted her in the spring of 2012, cooperated entirely with the investigation. She provided investigators with a written account of 19 years of observations, the late nights in the dark kitchen, the vigilant stillness at the mention of Carla's name, 3 specific occasions on which Dennis had made statements she described as self-referential, in the context of discussions about violence on the evening news, statements she had rationalized at the time and which she now, in the clear and devastating light of retrospect, understood differently. She also provided investigators with a manila envelope she had kept in a locked box in her bedroom closet since 2003. Inside the envelope was a piece of paper she had found 9 years earlier in the bottom of a box of Dennis's belongings she had been organizing. The paper was handwritten, his handwriting, she confirmed. It was a list of 6 items, seemingly mundane, with a specific date written at the top in the same hand. The date was February 3, 1993, the day before Carla Voss disappeared. The list was not presented in full in public court documents, but investigators, who described it in a sealed affidavit available to the court, characterized it as evidence of premeditation that they considered among the most significant elements of the prosecution's case. Sandra said she had found it in 2003, had sat on the floor of the bedroom reading it for what she estimated was 20 minutes, had then placed it carefully back in the envelope, put it in the box, locked the box, placed the key in a different location, and had not opened it again for 9 years. She did not explain this in terms of denial or fear, though both were clearly present. She explained it in a voice that an Ypsilanti County investigator described as the most controlled he had heard in 30 years of interviews, as a decision. She had been raising a child who loved her father. She had needed more time to be certain. She said, "I was certain by 2003, but I needed to decide what certainty required of me. That took until now." The press coverage of the arrest was immediate and significant. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune ran the story on the front page of the June 5th edition, under a headline that consumed 2 full columns above the fold. Television crews from 3 Twin Cities stations drove to Braham that afternoon and filmed the house on Birch Hollow Drive, which was by then 19 years removed from the Voss family, but which still bore the shape of the place where Carla had made coffee and written lunch notes, and watched a mail carrier drive past her front door. The detached garage, still leaning slightly to the left, was visible in the background of every shot. Former residents of Braham, when approached by reporters, divided largely into 2 camps, a division that tracked with uncomfortable precision along lines of proximity to the family. Those who had known Dennis peripherally, who had seen him at church or at the hardware store or at Public Works Department functions, expressed shock that ranged from genuine to performative. Several said some version of "I never would have thought it." Several could not be reached for comment. Those who had known Carla, her friends, her colleagues at Dr. Feldman's office, the women she had volunteered alongside at the food shelf, said things that were quieter and harder. One of them, a woman named Bate Carlson, who had been Carla's closest friend in Braham, told a reporter outside the Lutheran church on June 5th, "We knew. We always knew. We didn't know what we knew exactly, but we knew something. You could feel it in the way nobody said his name at Carla's memorial. You could feel it in the way people looked at each other when he moved away. I think a lot of people in this town have been waiting for this for a very long time." The trial of Dennis Roy Voss opened in Ypsilanti County District Court on March 4th, 2013, exactly 20 years and 28 days after Carla had last been seen standing in her doorway in a blue quilted coat. The prosecution was led by Assistant County Attorney Margaret Salminen, a methodical and quietly devastating litigator who had spent 6 months preparing a case that was, by the standard measures of criminal law, circumstantial, no eyewitnesses to the act. A cause of death complicated by the passage of time, physical evidence that required careful forensic interpretation. She built her case like a carpenter builds a frame, piece by piece, each element dependent on the others, the structure only visible once the whole was up. She called Tyler Voss to the stand on the 3rd day of trial. He was 26 years old. He sat in the witness box in a dark blazer and looked at the jury when he spoke, not at his father, who sat at the defense table 14 feet away. He described the afternoon of February 4th, 1993, the truck already in the parking lot, the question about their mother, the answer about grandma, the bags that weren't there, the hands on the steering wheel. He spoke without stuttering. When the defense attorney, a Minneapolis litigator named James P. Flaum, cross-examined Tyler and suggested that childhood memory was unreliable, Tyler said, "I know what I saw. I have known what I saw for 20 years. I didn't know what it meant. Now I do." He was dismissed from the stand. He walked past the defense table. He did not look at Dennis. Dennis looked at the table. Sandra Carla Voss testified on the fifth day. She testified for 3 hours. She presented the manila envelope. The handwritten list was entered into evidence. The court sealed the specific contents, but Salmonen referenced it in her summary as evidence of deliberate planning that preceded the events of February 4th by at least 16 hours. Forensic analysts testified. The BCA's soil and remains recovery specialists presented their methodology. Dr. Oberg presented her findings on the hyoid bone and the other indicators of traumatic causation. Telephone records were presented. The odometer discrepancy was presented, with a careful reconstruction of Dennis's likely route on the afternoon of February 4th. A route that, investigators had mapped using topographical and road data, was consistent with a 32-mile round trip to an area of state forest land south of Braham that had been searched in 1993 but not extensively excavated, and where investigators had found in 2012, though could not conclusively tie to the specific date. Evidence of recent disturbance at multiple sites along a fire road that connected to County Road 7. The defense argued an alternate theory, that Carla had been victimized by an unknown third party, that Dennis was a grieving husband who had been unfairly targeted, that the case against him was a confection of speculation assembled 20 years after the fact by investigators who had arrived at their conclusion before they examined their evidence. P. Flaum was skilled and thorough. He challenged every forensic interpretation. He challenged Tyler's memory. He challenged Sandra's timeline. He argued that the list in the manila envelope could be interpreted in multiple innocent ways. He could not challenge the remains. He could not challenge the location. The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. They returned on March 19, 2013, at 11:14 in the morning. The verdict was read by the court clerk in a silence so complete that those present in the gallery later said they could hear the fluorescent lights in the ceiling. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Dennis Roy Voss was sentenced on April 29, 2013, by the Honorable Judge Anne Marie Selvig to life in the Minnesota State Correctional System without the possibility of early release. He stood for sentencing without visible expression, his hands at his sides, his eyes directed at the middle distance above the judge's bench. He did not speak during allocution. He had no statement for the court. Judge Selvig, before pronouncing the sentence, looked at the courtroom from the bench. She said, "Carla Voss left notes for her children every single morning of her life. The people who loved her deserve to have answered, a long time ago, what happened to the woman who wrote them." Linda Meacham in the gallery pressed her hand flat against her mouth. She had kept every Sunday evening phone call logged in her address book for 31 years. The last entry read, February 7, 1993, no answer. She would later say that the moment the verdict was read was the first time in 20 years that the silence she'd been living inside felt different. Not full, not healed, not resolved in any way that word actually means, but different. She said Carla was still gone. Nothing changed that, but something had been said. Something had been put into the record. After 20 years of silence, someone had finally said her name in a room where it had to be heard. Music returned softly, the same strings from the opening, lower now, slower. The case of Carla Anne Voss, a woman who made lunch notes and called her sister every Sunday and stood in her doorway and waved at a passing mail carrier on a February morning in 1993. Is not ultimately a story about crime or investigation or even justice, though it contains all of these things. It is a story about silence, the silence that accumulates around unspoken knowledge, the silence children learn to keep when the truth is too large and too dangerous to name, The silence of a community that felt something was wrong and had no framework in which to say so. The silence of 27 years inside a locked cabinet in a sheriff's department in Isenti County, Minnesota. Tyler Voss returned to Duluth after the trial. Emma Voss, who had drawn the same house with the green shutters for years in elementary school, the figure in the blue coat standing in the doorway, moved to Wisconsin and became, in an ending that life sometimes provides with a particular quiet irony, a child therapist. She has spoken publicly about her mother twice, once in a newspaper interview in 2013, and once in a victim impact statement she submitted to the court at sentencing. In the statement, she wrote about the lunch notes, about the particular handwriting, the particular phrase, the way a person can compress all of the love they are capable of into 10 words on a scrap of paper before the school day starts. She wrote she was still there every morning in those notes. She is still there. Carla Anne Voss was 31 years old. She had a laugh that made other people laugh. She volunteered on Wednesday evenings. She called her sister every Sunday at 7. She loved her children all the way to the top of the sky. She deserved better than silence. She deserved to be heard.